Welcome to AM Best Audio.
Professors Albert Cohen of Michigan State University and Annette Hoffman of the University of Cincinnati have collaborated on a study titled Regretful Risks. Their research delves into how the fear of future regret shapes decision-making from financial choices and insurance purchases to broader risk management behavior. By combining insights from behavioral economics, psychology, and risk theory, the research shows that emotions play a far greater role in shaping our approach to risk than most models assume. I'm John Weber for Best Review Magazine, and my guests today are the aforementioned professors Albert Cohen and Annette Hoffman. And Professor Cohen, let's start with you today. Your research explores how regret impacts risk-taking behavior. What led you to focus on this particular emotional dimension, and how does it fit within your broader work on risk theory?
Thank you. So I'm interested in topics in quantitative finance, as well as their overlap in other areas such as sports analytics. And behavioral finance finds its thumbprints everywhere. And so I found it a lot, for example, optimal investing, such as maximal expected utility theory. And that led me years ago to give a talk at Professor Hoffman's old university. And that's where we first started chatting. And then she opened up this fantastic world of, well, what happens if you add regret to risk aversion and how those things are different and how they overlap. And it's really opened up a new avenue of research, which I'm very proud to collaborate on with Anne.
Professor Hoffman, much of your work looks at behavioral factors influencing insurance decisions. How does the concept of regret help explain why consumers sometimes overinsure or underinsure against certain risks?
Well, especially if you're looking into what we call a long-tail risk, so a risk that has a very high severity, but really the frequency is not that often, right? So these are rare events that happen. In that case, very often we feel that we have this insurance policy in place, but we don't really see the benefit of it, right? Because it doesn't pay out. We don't have any loss or anything. So from a regret theoretical perspective, that makes sense to incorporate that into a typical decision maker situation where we anticipate the potential regret we're experiencing when we make the insurance decision, if we purchase insurance or not. And so sometimes when we feel it's not really worthwhile because it just really maybe will never happen to me, why should I invest into an annual or monthly premium to cover that risk, right? On the other hand, if at some point there's a big flood or earthquake and my house is damaged and my mortgage is paid off, so I don't really am forced to pay for that anymore, I might have a really big regret because, now I cannot pay for it anymore because the insurance is not covering. Because I don't have insurance. I'm regretting not buying it. So especially for these types of risks, I think it's very important to look into regret theoretical decision making.
Professor Cohen, traditional economic models often assume rational decision-making. How does incorporating regret into these frameworks change our understanding of how individuals evaluate risk and reward?
It's a fantastic question. So utility basically says that people don't enjoy consumption linearly. They enjoy it in either a risk-averse or even maybe a risk-seeking way. And again, I don't even think it scales by wealth level. One of my favorite examples is in Dale Carnegie's book, How to Enjoy Life and Stop Worrying, I think it is, where he talks about John Rockefeller, this case where he has to send, I think it was $50,000 worth of wheat across the Great Lakes, and he had to buy insurance for $150. And this is at that point in time, the richest man on earth. And so, of course, this is a great example of, how to enjoy life and what things you should do. But he has one of his employees race down and pay for the insurance. And then the barge makes it across the Great Lakes unscathed. And now he's worried about, I spent $150 for nothing. And so it's not just for us as individuals insuring phones versus homes. It really can be just a human behavior. And so in terms of rational behavior, I think the delightful thing about humans is that we're irrational. And that's where I think some of the money is. We like to think that we understand risk, but I personally see risk as like energy. In my background as a physics major way back when, energy and physics are the same, energy and risk are the same, where energy cannot be created or destroyed, just, transmuted. Same thing for risk. You can price it or mitigate it, but you never really get rid of it. The only thing is that risk lies dormant, as Professor Hoffman was pointing out. And you have this regret. If you don't see it often enough, you feel like you wasted that premium. And that's part of what our study shows, is that people who have this regret aversion just feel bad about making a bad decision. So it kind of draws upon prospect theory and those kinds of fantastic ideas that are out there. So yeah, I mean, I think that the idea of rationality kind of goes out the window when you talk with humans, as much as we like to think otherwise.
It also explains the other side, right? So thinking about the mobile phone insurance market that has grown tremendously over the last years and is really projected to grow further. Think about insuring your mobile phone, which is really not a very valuable object. I know we use it every day, but losing your phone or having a broken phone is not going to change your life that much. But there's a huge market out for that. And the question is, why do people even buy this product? It's highly overpriced. And it's a very small risk, but it reveals very often I think the median time to have a broken phone is something between 3 and 4 months. So every 3 to 4 months, something with your phone statistically happens. And if you have that covered, that gives you a good feeling, right? You don't have a lot of regret because you submit your phone back to your insurer, and they will just pay for the repair. So that's a contrary example to that. I also wanted to say that we were discussing that we wanted to incorporate the Rockefeller story into our paper, but then we thought, because it's a research paper, we're probably not going to do that, but it would have been an anecdote if we had our way, right?
It really illuminated for me, that it's just a human thing. We all have regret. I mean, I've experienced it myself, buying a ticket, let's say on the secondary market, thinking I got a deal, and then you look in the primary market, it's even cheaper. And so you always, oh, darn it, I shouldn't have done this. And again, as Anne points out, it's not gonna set our lives in a different path, but it's something that we live with, and it's something that as humans we're trying to figure out. I hope that we never become too rational. I think that's where the fun is in being a human.
Professor Hoffman, in the insurance context, what practical steps could companies take to design products or messaging that help consumers make more confident and less regret-driven choices?
I think there's several angles to that. I think one angle would be to increase what we call risk literacy. So the American population is not very risk literate. We know that the financial literacy coefficient has gone down over the years, and there's several explanations for that. But especially when it comes to dealing with risk, the Americans are not very risk literate. The same holds true for Europeans and other countries, but it's just that the way our brains are wired, we are just not very rational when it comes to making decisions under risk. And the question is, how can we become better? How can we be educated to be better decision makers? And I think this is a long way to really understand. But when it comes to your questions, so the products, I think, can be designed in a way to incentivize consumers to make the right decisions. It's also called nudging, right? So we can try to nudge consumers into what we consider the most rational decision-making process. We could, for instance, offer subsidies for catastrophe risks, for the premiums that are going to be paid for catastrophe risks. And these subsidies might help increase flood insurance demand. There's unfortunately studies out there that show that even if the premiums are subsidized, the demand for flood insurance is not going to respond in a way that policymakers would like the public to see. But at least we can try design products in a way that nudges consumers into the right direction.
Customize your data experience. BestLink now offers an interactive company dashboard that provides company-level intelligence in a fast, user-friendly interface featuring interactive tables, charts, and Sparkline performance histories. Customize the dashboard tiles to prioritize the insurer ratings, data, and analytics that best support your workflow. AM Best. Our insight, your advantage.
Professor Cohen, from a theoretical standpoint, do you see regret as primarily a bias that clouds judgment, or as potentially adaptive mechanism that can lead to better long-term outcomes?
First time I thought about this, I thought it was the former, but I think it's more a hybrid of both. When we first started looking at the problem, when Anne gave me this problem to think about, I just started tinkering around with the variables, which is what mathematicians do. And it's been years since I've had to do calculus, for a living. But looking at the risk calculus in this problem, I realized if you rewrote some of the variables instead of just purely probability or purely severity of loss, but instead of relative variables, things like this, we were able to come up with the solution. And so to answer your question, I think that, and to answer also to add to the previous question, I think in terms of incentivizing behavior, I think we maybe need to rethink about how customers think about risk. They don't just think about purely probability or purely loss or even their product. They might think about relative loss. And we saw this, for example, where people did not get full coverage. One of the questions that Anne asked me is that, hey, are there cases where people don't get full coverage, even in the case of a very severe loss? And the answer was yes. And so thinking about what are some of the triggers for that? So I think that, yes, in general, understanding the variables that people consider going into this would be helpful to design some of the products and maybe illuminate the post-event regret that you might feel. I think that might induce people or to nudge people, as Anne says, to buy some of these new hybrid products we want to build.
Another point in the paper, when you look into the paper, is that, and this is an idea that Albert came up with, and I loved it when he said, the loss actually is something relative to the individual and relative to the individual's position when it comes to their wealth. And this is why in a section of our paper, we actually look into the individual's loss ratio. How much does this investment make out of your wealth, right? How big is that loss ratio? And given that situation, maybe you feel a different level of regret simply because this is a larger proportion of your wealth that's being affected. And so that makes you, that induces you to make a different decision.
Professor Hoffman, your research suggests that emotion and risks are deeply intertwined. How do you think the industry can balance empathy with analytics in helping people navigate uncertainty?
Well, so there's two notions: navigating uncertainty and navigating risk. So uncertainty is much more difficult to navigate than risk, because when you navigate risk, you have at least an idea or some kind of an estimate about the probability and the severity of the situation, the loss you're dealing with. When it comes to uncertainty, you really don't know. So you need to come up with some subjective estimate about the situation. And that makes it much more difficult to deal with than a situation under risk. And we're all learners. So even myself, I sometimes make a decision and then I feel like, come on, you could have known better, right? I mean, you have studied this, right? You're an expert on this, or at least trying to be, right? So it's a learning process to realize that, yeah, we are all driven by our emotions, maybe much more than we should. And when it comes to negative experiences, and the loss in the insured sense is always a negative experience, then our irrationality, I think, kicks in even more. And that makes it unattractive to think about losses, insurance, and insurance premiums, and if we should, invest them, because we can only spend our money once. So should we spend our money on that? Maybe the painful feeling is not helpful.
Professor Cohen, based on your findings, how should risk professionals in fields like insurance, investing, or policy design adjust their models or communication strategies to account for regret-driven behavior?
Fantastic question. So I think one of the things, and I think you see this also in cigarettes, right? So for example, in cigarettes, they'll have now pictures and see these sort of gruesome things of the outcome. And I mean, smoking has gone down in the Western world, I would imagine, maybe at least in North America, and maybe partially due to these things. So again, if people could visualize what that loss would be like to them individually, with artificial intelligence videos that are out there, or these sorts of things that can help people understand, yes, this is a very infrequent loss, but if heaven forbid, if it was to happen, these are the things that you would lose. It wouldn't just be a monetary loss, but the sort of down the chain, as Anne was pointing out. I think one of the things would be visualization tools. The next thing is, I think, really to understand how people individually look at wealth. And then it's kind of come back into fashion with reinforcement learning, but the idea of utility theory. I personally believe in utility theory. I think it's a fantastic way to understand at least some prototypical models of human behavior. So trying to ask, what is your utility? Are you a X to the one half utility person? Are you a logarithmic investor, which is, I mean, for me, that's sort of how I would think, just maximizing expected return kind of idea. So I think just trying to do these sort of questionnaires and thinking about how people are investing, sort of what maybe a financial planner might sit down and do with you. So I think designing products that are more individualized in terms of the mathematics, in terms of the modeling, but also the visualization, kind of borrowing from other industries, what they've done.
Professor Hoffman, looking ahead, what new research directions do you see emerging from Regretful Risks?
Yes, that is a discussion Elva and I are having, and we hope to work on some research in the future that involves risk and the anticipation of having potentially made a bad decision ex post. So what can emerge from that? I think there's a lot of different applications that we can potentially look at. We can look at different phenomena that we see in different markets. We could look into investing behavior. We can look into social media behavior. You can post something online and hope for a good effect, but it has a bad effect, and then you're having some ex post regrets. So every decision basically involves risk when it comes to certain markets, social media markets, investment markets, and different other markets. And so maybe that could be applied elsewhere. It doesn't necessarily need to be reduced to investing into insurance.
One of the things that yes, I was going to say, one of the things that we've been talking about, and not to tip our hand too much, if you look at, for example, in-game performance versus post-game press conference, right? You may make a decision that seems a bit aggressive, and if it works out, that's great. And if it doesn't work out, you've got to answer for it, with the press scrum afterwards. And so these kinds of things, I mean, can we determine somebody's risk aversion based, on their historical kind of post-game behavior? I mean, these are some of the things that, without going into too many details, because this is work underway, we think is going to bear some fruit. I mean, we're very interested in how humans behave, and whether it's nudging the behavior or at least, marketing a product that helps them to make decisions more comfortably. That's what we're interested in. And so I think sports is one area, but I think risk management is such a huge field that insurance, I think there's a lot of room for us to grow and design these kinds of products that help to illuminate the risk, to understand what are people's individual risk triggers, whether it's relative wealth to loss ratio. Lots of work to be done.
There's also an interaction between risk aversion and regret aversion, right? It might be that somebody is really, really risk averse, but not very much regret averse, and vice versa. And I don't think this interaction between risk aversion and regret aversion hasn't really been explored so far. So that was one application we might dig into, but research is always open. So yeah, we don't know yet.
Well, this is one interview I do not regret doing. Professors Hoffman, Professor Cohen, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you, John. Pleasure.
You're very much welcome. Thank you for having us.
The title of the study is Regretful Risks. That was Professors Albert Cohen and Annette Hoffman. And I'm John Weber for Best Review Magazine.
Looking to get the full attention of the insurance industry? We have the platforms that will do just that. Whether it be AM Best TV, AM Best Audio, Best Review Magazine, or Best Day. Find out more by calling AM Best Advertising Sales at 908-439-2200, extension 5399, and have a great day.